OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, is based on a simple concept that employees have both a need and a right to know the hazards and identities of chemicals they are exposed to when working. They also need to know what protective measures are available to prevent adverse effects from occurring. OSHA designed the HCS to provide employees with the information they need to know. The HCS addresses the issues of evaluating and communicating chemical hazard information to workers. Evaluation of chemical hazards involves a number of technical concepts and is a process that requires the professional judgment of experienced experts. That's why the HCS is designed so that employers who simply use chemicals rather than produce or import them are not required to evaluate the hazards of those chemicals. Hazard determination is the responsibility of the manufacturers and importers of chemicals, who then must provide hazard information to employers that purchase their products. Employers that do not produce or import chemicals need only to focus on those parts of the rule that deal with establishing a workplace program and communicating information to their workers. This publication is a general guide for such employers to help them determine what the HCS requires. It does not supplant or substitute for regulatory provisions, but rather provides a simplified outline of steps an average employer would follow to meet those requirements. About 32 million workers are potentially exposed to one or more chemical hazards. There are an estimated 575,000 existing chemical products and hundreds of new ones being introduced annually. This poses a serious problem for exposed workers and their employers. Chemical exposure may cause or contribute to many serious health effects such as heart ailments, kidney and lung damage, sterility, cancer, burns, and rashes. Some chemicals may also be involved in other serious accidents. Because of the seriousness of these safety and health problems, and because many employers and employees know little or nothing about them, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, issued a rule called Hazard Communication. The basic rule of the standard is to be sure employers and employees know about work hazards and how to protect themselves. This should help to reduce the incidence of material safety data sheets, MSDSs. In addition, all covered employees must have a hazard communication program to get this information to their employees through labels, containers, MSDSs, and training. This program ensures that all employers receive the information they need to inform and train their employees properly and to design and put in place employee protection programs. It also provides necessary hazard information to employees so they can participate in and support the protective measures in place at their workplace. The standard itself is long and some parts are technical, but the basic concepts are simple. In fact, the requirements reflect what many employers have been doing for years. You may find that you already largely comply with many of the provisions and will simply have to modify your existing program somewhat. If you are operating in an OSHA-approved state plan state, you must comply with the state's requirements, which may be different than those of the federal rule. Many of the state plan states had hazard communication or right-to-know laws prior to the announcement of the federal rule. The HCS requires information to be prepared and transmitted regarding all hazardous chemicals. The HCS covers both physical hazards such as flammability and health hazards such as irritation, lung damage, and cancer. Most chemicals used in the workplace have some hazard potential and thus will be covered by the rule. One difference between this rule and many others adopted by OSHA is that this one is performance-oriented. That means you have the flexibility to adapt to the rule, the needs of your workplace, rather than follow specific rigid requirements. It also means that you have to exercise more judgment to implement and appropriate an effective program. The standard's design is simple. Chemical manufacturers and importers must evaluate the hazards of the chemicals they produce or import. Using that information, they must then prepare labels for containers and more detailed technical bulletins called Material Safety Data Sheets, MSDSs. OSHA has developed a variety of materials and publications to help employers and employees develop and implement effective hazard communication programs. Before explaining the details of various parts of Hazard Communication Standard, a brief overview of the design of the standard may be helpful. The Hazard Communication Standard is different from other OSHA health rules because it covers all hazardous chemicals. The rule also incorporates a downstream flow of information, which means that producers of chemicals have the primary responsibility for generating and denouncing information, whereas users of chemicals must obtain the information and transmit it to their own employees. In general, it works like this. Chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors determine the hazard of each product. They communicate the hazard information and associated protective measures downstream to customers through labels and MSDSs. Employers identify and list hazardous chemicals in their workplaces. They obtain MSDSs and labels for each hazardous chemical. Employers develop and implement a written hazard communication program including labels, MSDSs, and employee training, named on the list of chemical, MSDSs, and label information. They communicate hazardous information to their employees through labels, MSDSs, and formal training programs. The quality of hazard communication program depends on the adequacy of hazard assessment. Chemical manufacturers and importers are required to review available scientific evidence concerning the hazard of the chemicals they produce or import and to report the information they find to their employees and to employers who distribute or use their products. Downstream employers can rely on the evaluation performed by the chemical manufacturers or importers to establish the hazards of the chemicals they use. The chemical manufacturers, importers, and any employers who choose to evaluate hazards are responsible for the quality of the hazard determinations they perform. Each chemical must be evaluated for its potential to cause adverse health effects and its potential to pose physical hazards such as flammability. Employers must develop, implement, and maintain at the workplace a written comprehensive hazard communication program that includes provisions for container labeling, collection and availability of material safety data sheets, and an employee training program. It also must contain a list of hazardous chemicals in each work area. The means the employer will use to inform employees of the hazards of non-routine tasks, for example, the cleaning of reactors, vessels, and the hazards in unlabeled pipes associated with employers. If the workplace has multiple employers on site, for example, a construction site, the rule requires these employers to ensure that information regarding employers on site is available where appropriate. Chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors must be sure that containers of hazardous chemicals leaving the workplace are labeled or marked with the identity, appropriate hazard warnings, and the name and address of the manufacturer or other responsible party. In the workplace, each container must be labeled, tagged, or marked with the identity of the hazardous chemicals contained therein, and must show hazard warnings appropriate for employee protection. The hazard warning can be any type of message, words, pictures, or symbols that provide at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemical or chemicals in the container. Labels must be legible in English plus other languages if desired, and prominently displayed. Exemption to the requirement for in-plant individual container labels is as follows. Employers can post signs or place cards that convey the hazard information if there are a number of stationary containers within a work area that have similar contents and hazards. Employers can substitute various types of standard operating procedures, process sheets, batch tickets, blend tickets, and similar written materials for container labels on stationary process equipment if they contain the same information and the written materials are readily accessible to employees in the work area. Employers are not required to label portable containers into which hazardous chemicals are transferred from labeled containers and that are intended only for the immediate use of the employee who makes the transfer. Employers are not required to label pipes or piping systems. Chemical manufacturers and importers must develop an MSDS for each hazardous chemical they produce or import and must provide the MSDS automatically at the time of initial shipment of a hazardous chemical to a downstream distributor or user. Distributors must also ensure that downstream employers are similarly provided an MSDS. Each MSDS must be in English and include information regarding the specific chemical identity of the hazardous chemicals involved utilizing common names. In addition, information must be provided on the physical and chemical characteristics of the hazardous chemical, known acute and chronic health effects, and related health information. Exposure limits, whether the chemical is considered to be a carcinogen by NTP, IARC, or OSHA, precautionary measures, emergency and first aid procedures, and the identification, name, address, and telephone number of the organization responsible for preparing the sheet. Copies of the MSDS for hazardous chemicals in a given worksite are to be readily accessible to employees in that area. A source of detailed information on hazards must be located close to workers and readily available to them during each work shift. MSDSs have no prescribed format. ANSI standard number Z400.1 material safety data sheet preparation may be used. The non-mandatory MSDS form OSHA 174 may also be used as a guide. A copy can be obtained from OSHA field offices. Employers must prepare a list of all hazardous chemicals in the workplace. When the list is complete, it should be checked against the collected MSDSs that the employer has been sent. If there are hazardous chemicals used for which no MSDS has been received, the employer must write to the supplier, manufacturer, or importer to obtain the missing MSDS. Employers must establish training and information programs for employees exposed to hazardous chemicals in their work area in the time of initial assignment and whenever a new hazard is introduced into their work area. At a minimum, the topics must include the Hazard Communication Standard and its requirements, the components of the Hazard Communication Program in the employee workplace, and operations in and around work areas where hazardous chemicals are present. The employer must keep the written hazard evaluation procedures, communications program, list of hazardous chemicals, and the required MSDS forms. The employee training plan must consist of the following elements: how the hazard communication program is implemented in the workplace, how to read and interpret the information on labels and the MSDS, how employees can obtain and use the available hazard information, the hazards of the chemicals in the work area, measures employees can take to protect themselves from the hazards, specific procedures put into effect by the employer to provide protection such as engineering controls, work practices, and the use of personal protective equipment, PPE, and methods and observations such as visual appearance or smell in order for workers to detect the presence of a hazardous chemical to which they may be exposed. Trade secrets are something that gives an employer an opportunity to obtain an advantage over competitors who do not know about the trade secrets or who do not use them. For example, trade secrets may be a confidential device, pattern, information, or chemical makeup. Chemical industry trade secrets are generally formulas, process data, or a specific identity. The latter is the type of trade secrets information referred to in the Hazard Communication Standard. The term includes the chemical name, the Chemical Abstract Service, CAS, registry number, or any other specific information that reveals a precise designation. It does not include common names. The standard strikes a balance between the need to protect exposed employees and the employer's need to maintain the confidentiality of a bona fide trade secret. This is achieved by providing limited disclosure to health professionals who are furnishing medical or other occupational health services to exposed employees and their designated representatives under specific conditions of need and confidentiality. The manufacturer, importer, or employer must immediately disclose the specific chemical identity of a hazardous chemical to a treating physician or nurse when the information is needed for proper emergency or first aid treatment. As soon as circumstances permit, the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer may obtain a written statement of need and a confidentiality agreement. Under the contingency described here, the treating physician or nurse has the ultimate responsibility for determining that a medical emergency exists. At the time of the emergency, the professional judgment of the physician or nurse regarding the situation must form the basis for triggering the immediate disclosure requirement. Because the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employers can demand a written statement of a need and a confidentiality agreement to be completed after the emergency is abated, further disclosure of the trade secret can be effectively controlled. In non-emergency situations, chemical manufacturers, importers, or employers must disclose the withheld specific chemical identity to healthcare professionals providing medical or other occupational health services to exposed employees, and to employees and their designated representatives if certain conditions are met. In this context, healthcare professionals include physicians, occupational health nurses, industrial hygienists, toxicologists, and epidemiologists. The request for information must be in writing and must describe with reasonable detail the medical or occupational health need for the information. The request will be considered if the information will be used for one or more of the following activities: to assess the hazards of the chemicals to which employees will be exposed, to conduct or assess sampling of the workplace atmosphere to determine employee exposure levels, to conduct pre-assignment or periodic medical surveillance of exposed employees, to provide medical treatment to exposed employees, to select or assess appropriate personal protective equipment for exposed employees, to design or assess engineering controls or other protective measures for exposed employees, and to conduct studies to determine the health effects of exposure. The health professional, employee, or designated representative must also specify why alternative information is insufficient. The specific chemical identity is essential and include the procedures to be used to protect the confidentiality of the information. It must include an agreement not to use the information for any purpose other than the health need stated or to release it under any circumstances except to OSHA. The standard further describes in detail the steps that will be followed in the event that an employer decides not to disclose the specific chemical identity requested by the healthcare professional, employee, or designated representative. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, is based on a simple concept that employees have both a need and a right to know the hazards and identities of the chemicals they are exposed to when working. HCS dictates how the Hazard Communication Program is implemented in the workplace, how to read and interpret information on labels and the MSDS, how employees can obtain and use the available hazard information, the hazards of chemicals in the work area, and know ways to prevent exposure through personal protective equipment. Where applicable, employers are responsible of training of employees on this subject matter in an effort to reduce incidents.